can go ahead and take a look. This is what we want it to look like. Obviously, not a great Web 2 developer here, but this is a fairly simple web UI where we have up here some status text, and we're going to have a drop down for all the accounts we connect button to connect our Pera Wallet, and then buttons to do each individual step of the auction lifecycle. So a button to create it, start auction, and send a bid. And then we have input arguments to each of these functions, which ASA ID are we going to be bidding, how much of that ASA are we bidding, and then, or which ASA ID are we auctioning, how much are we auctioning, and then how much we want the auction to start for, or when we're bidding, how much we want to bid. So that's our very basic UI. So taking a look at our HTML, here in our index.html, you can see that we have a select box for our accounts, just called accounts, our connect button, create button, a ASA input, an ASA amount input, a start button, and an amount input, and then a bid button. And so that's what our front end looks like. Very simple, just basic HTML. And then if we head on over to our index.ts, this is where the actual logic begins. What we're first going to do is import our Algo SDK, and then we're also directly importing this class as well, because we're going to be commonly using it. So we're importing our Algo SDK in our Atomic Transaction Composer. If you attended the first session, then you are probably familiar with these in our JavaScript SDK. If you attended last session, we used very similar things in Python using the PySDK and the Atomic Transaction Composer in Python. We're going to be doing the same thing here. And what we're also doing is importing Pera session from Wallet's Pera. And this Wallet's directory is provided in that web template. And here, if we take a look at the Pera file, what it's basically doing is providing us a class that we can use to instantiate a new Pera Connect session, then has a function for getting the accounts and signing the transactions. And I'm not going to be going too in-depth into this code because we've already provided it here. But basically, what this get accounts is doing is it's going to get all the accounts that the user wants to connect and then set them in a list of accounts and then do some error handling as well. And then sign transactions, as the name suggests, is going to take unsigned transactions and return signed transactions. Okay, so that's our Pera import. We're also importing our generic utils library, and we're going to basically be using this. We take a look here at what our utils includes. We have a function called get readable state. What this is basically going to do is help us read state from our application. Okay, so now we have imported those three kind of core libraries, and then we have two additional imports. We have our AlgoKit import, so we're importing everything from AlgoKit under the AlgoKit namespace. And you'll notice that this library is called AlgoKit utils. As the name suggests, this basically provides some utilities that is helpful to developers when they're building with AlgoKit. And then finally, we have our import app spec from application JSON. So this is why in our TS config, we want to make sure we enable JSON imports. What we're basically doing here is importing our application JSON file. So if we go ahead and take a look, application JSON, what this file does is it contains basically all the information that our front end should know about our contract. So it tells us all the methods we have, what on completions they support, what the source code is, and then we go down here, gives us information for the global state, and tells us information about our methods as well. So all the information in our ABI JSON, plus additional information about typing and how we create it and things like that. So we're going to be importing that directly as a variable called appspec. And now what we can do is go ahead and get into our actual code. So here in our first line, we're just instantiating this Pera object. We're using this import from our wallet's Pera library. We're basically saying we want to be able to later in the code to use this Pera object to connect our wallet and populate our accounts array. So instantiating that. Then we also want to instantiate two clients here. Our first of which is an algod client, and this is going to be connecting to testnet. So you see here, what algod v2 expects is a token, and then a URL, and then a port. In our case, we're using this public API provided by Algorand. So we're going to connect to testnet api.algorand.cloud. And because it's a public API, there's no token. And since we have defined that's HTTPS, we don't need to define a port manually as well. And so what this is going to do is provide us a client to algod, so a client to the network that we'll use for deployment and reading state. And then we also have an indexer client. And what this is, it allows us to do more advanced queries on the network. So this is creating a Postgres database that contains the full history of the blockchain. And it allows us to do some more advanced queries as well. And it's doing that through a piece of software called the indexer. So that's why we're instantiating an algo SDK.index here. So by default, every node, it has an algod endpoint, and then you can optionally run an indexer. Here, Algorand has provided both a public API endpoint for algod and a public API endpoint for indexer. So we're instantiating those two clients. The main important thing here is that we're connecting to testnet rather than our local network. And then finally, what we want to do is instantiate our contract. So what we're doing is going to call algo.sdk.abi.contract or algo.sdk.abi.contract. We're passing in appspec.contract. And if we take a look at what appspec.contract is, it's simply our ABI, the equivalent of our ABI JSON file. And this includes all of our methods in it. And we'll be using this later in order to actually call our methods. So now we've instantiated our clients and our contract object. One last thing we want to instantiate actually is our auction app ID. So we're not actually instantiating it with a value, we're just defining it. And this is going to be a global variable that we use throughout our entire code base here. So once we deploy our auction, we're going to be saving the app ID here in auction app ID. Okay, so now what we're going to do is basically just connect our HTML front end to our front end JavaScript. So here we're just connecting basically all of our menus and inputs to actual variables that we can interact with. So here we have a bunch of buttons and inputs, and we're just connecting all of them. So here we're connecting our inputs. And then here we're connecting all of our buttons as well. So we'll have all of our inputs as variables and then all of our buttons as entries into our buttons object. So we've set up our environment now, and we're ready to get started with our code. Now, the first thing we want to do, and you basically always want to do this when you're working with either the Atomic Transaction Composer or the AlgoKit utils, is set up a signer function. And the signer function is a special function that we're going to be constantly using to tell the SDK how we want to sign all our transactions. So the signer function, it expects an input of unsigned Algo SDK transactions. So here we're expecting an array of transaction objects from the Algo SDK. And then it expects us to return a uint 8 array, an array of uint 8 arrays. So basically this is saying we take in Algo SDK transaction objects in an array, and then we return raw binary data in an array. And now in our case, for our signer function, we're simply just going to call await Pera.sign transactions. And again, this sign transactions here is provided in this Pera.ts file.